Hello, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is a video for my Lindenwood University course in classic horror and sci-fi by women writers. This is going to be a little bit different edition. For one thing, it's our snowstorm edition. We're being really hit hard here in the Midwest. Universities are closing and everything is closing, etc. But I want to talk to you today about a writer who doesn't quite fit into what this course is about because she didn't write horror or science fiction, but was an important author nevertheless. And like so many of the writers that we're studying in this course, she has definitely been largely forgotten, unfortunately. Some of the writers that we encounter in our anthology are still very well known and widely read. Mary Shelley, Edith Wharton, Elizabeth Gaskell, Virginia Woolf, we'll get to eventually, and so on. But most of the writers, while they were popular in their day, have kind of fallen by the wayside in terms of our reading today. Sometimes they get anthologized, as they did in our book, but oftentimes not. And I really like the book. Obviously, I chose it for the course. In fact, the course grew out of my getting that book, and I was reading it. And I thought, wow, this would make a great textbook for a class. So here it is. But and I do, and one of the things I like about the anthology is that it gives us the opportunity to read some of these writers who aren't read very much, if at all, anymore. Like, for example, we just, finished reading Gertrude Atherton last week, not someone that you normally find in anthologies. And again, most of the writers we're encountering are not widely read today. The only thing that I'm a little bit I would count as kind of in the negative column regarding the anthology. It doesn't have very much diversity. I think the author or the editor rather could have worked in some supernatural stories by Black women authors, because there certainly is a strong tradition of writing supernatural fiction in the African American community, and maybe in particular among African American women authors. Just off the top of my head, today you think of writers like Octavia Butler. Toni Morrison frequently has included supernatural elements, especially ghosts, in her writing. Another one of my favorite writers, Colson Whitehead, not a female, but an African American author, oftentimes includes supernatural elements, like, for example, in the Underground Railroad, not ghosts exactly, but certainly a supernatural kind of element in the story, and other works by him as well. And of course, if you Google, ghost stories by Black women authors or something like that, you can find various sites that give you, pretty detailed lists of authors that you could check out in that arena. I want to, though, talk about another author who, again, doesn't quite fit in terms of being a horror or sci-fi writer, but unfortunately little known today. Certainly from the time period that we're sort of focusing on, which is roughly from sort of the last couple of decades, or I guess really the last half of the 19th century into about 1930 or so of the 20th century. So she's right in that time period. But I encountered her because of my involvement in this project. I worked with the editor of this project, Yolanda Williams Page, the Encyclopedia of African American Women Writers. It's actually a 2-volume set. I was just starting to work on my doctorate when I saw the call for papers. I guess that's how I got involved in this project. I'm not really quite sure. It's been a while. The 2-volume anthology was published in 2007, just to give you an idea. But I contacted the editor, who I didn't know other than just to see this sort of call for papers, and said I'd like to be involved, and told her a little bit about my background. At the time, I was regularly teaching an introductory course in African American authors, and so I kind of led with that. And so she gave me an assignment and told me to write an article on Fannie Barrier Williams. And I had never heard of Fannie Barrier Williams. and I discovered there wasn't a lot written about her, which on the one hand made my job a little more challenging, but made the work all that more important. To have her included in this 2-volume set. Obviously, a lot of the writers in here are, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, on and on and on, and so are very well known. But on the other hand, there are a lot of listings for African American women writers who, like I said, nowadays are not very well known or hardly known at all. Now, so it became a challenge to be able to research her and write, the kind of article I was expected to write, but then also very gratifying to, make sure that she was included in a well-written way in this encyclopedia. So I'm going to share with you in just a couple minutes here the entry that I wrote about her. Unfortunately, volumes like this are kind of falling by the wayside. I don't know that they're really being produced anymore. They were produced. This is from Greenwood Press, which was sort of known for these kinds of books, these kinds of, pretty expensive hardcover editions that would mainly be purchased by libraries, particularly university libraries and so forth. But nowadays, because of the internet, you can go and find information on just about anyone. And in fact, before I made this video, I was just kind of curious, and I searched Fannie Barrier Williams, and sure enough, there are a few sites that give really good detailed information about her. And so when I wrote the article and when this was published, this was one of the few places you could really get much information about her. Now, luckily, you can all kinds of places, but it has made these kind of books, these kind of projects obsolete. I really enjoyed working on this project, and I enjoyed working with Yolanda Page, and I didn't know her other than just via email. So when this project was coming to an end, I asked her if she had any other projects in the works, because I'd really enjoy working with her on those. And sure enough, she was working on an anthology of critical articles about African Americans who had won a Pulitzer Prize. And so I said, yeah, count me in. So she asked me to write a lengthy article, critical article on the poet and essayist Yusef Kamyukaya. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. And again, when assigned, didn't know very much about him. I knew the name, I think, but unfortunately that was about all I knew. But so I really took a deep dive, and I spent several months reading all of his work, researching him, reading a bunch of critical articles about his work, writing a pretty detailed and lengthy article for this anthology, which I sent to Yolanda, and she gave the thumbs up. So I thought, cool, I'm going to have this article in this anthology, which again I thought was a very cool idea. But then a few months later, she emailed all the contributors, and the publisher had pulled the plug and was not going to publish the volume after all. I think I tried to present my paper at a conference. I submitted the proposal, and it was rejected, as a lot of proposals are at conferences. And I don't know, I just kind of fell by the wayside. I'm not even sure I have a copy of the paper anymore, which I wish I did. I'd do something with it, just post it on my own blog or something, whatever. But anyway, let me get back to Fannie Barrier Williams. Really interesting person, and I think an important writer at the end of the 19th century and the first decade or so of the 20th century, but again largely forgotten. And so I'm just going to kind of read my entry, lengthy entry somewhat, about Fannie Barrier Williams, just to share a little bit about her with you. Again, it's Black History Month, so I thought that would be appropriate maybe to have sort of a special edition today regarding that. Just a little bit of background. The format of the entries was very specific. So when I was given her name, I was also given sort of a format that I was expected to follow. So the way this is sort of laid out is how all the entries in the encyclopedia are laid out. But here I go. Fannie Barrier Williams, born 1855, died 1944. And the first section is titled Biographical Narrative. Journalist, orator, sociologist, school teacher. These are just a few of the influential roles that Fannie, that is, Frances Barrier Williams, assumed during her 89 years. She was born in Brockport, New York, and died there, but lived much of her adult life in Chicago from 1887 to 1926. There, she and her husband, S. Lang Williams, an attorney, were leaders in the Prudence Crandall Club, a literary society that aggressively promoted social activism on behalf of African Americans and whites alike. Williams was born on February 12, 1855, to Harriet Prince and Anthony J. Barrier. Of her formative years in Western New York, William writes that, quote, "We suffered from no discriminations on account of color and lived in blissful ignorance of the fact that we were practicing the unpardonable sin of," inside quote, "social equality." At the State Normal School in Brockport, she pursued both academic and classical coursework and graduated in 1870 with a certificate to teach school. Her education was profoundly impacted by the transcendentalists, especially the writings of Emerson and Thoreau. I'm sure you studied those characters in school. Seeking adventure and wanting to contribute to sweeping historical change, Williams moved south during Reconstruction to be a school teacher. Her insulated northern childhood proved poor preparation for the level of racism she encountered while traveling and teaching in the southern states. Nevertheless, she stayed true to her mission for a number of years, eventually ending up in Washington, D.C., where she became acquainted with many Black intellectuals and activists. In 1887, at the age of 32, she married, and the newlyweds moved to Chicago. During their Chicago years, the Williamses worked and socialized with a plethora of distinguished African Americans, including Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, and Webb Du Bois. Williams's speech, titled "The Intellectual Progress of the Colored Women of the United States Since the Emancipation Proclamation," at the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, put her in the national spotlight for the first time. That same year, Williams and Mary Church Terrell were instrumental in the establishment of the National League of Colored Women, and 3 years later they worked to found the National Association of Colored Women. Williams began writing newspaper articles in 1895 when she became a correspondent for Women's Era, the first publication for and by African American women. In the summer of 1904, Williams's A Northern Negro's Autobiography appeared in the widely read journal The Independent. Williams was reacting to a Williams was reacting rather to a series of articles the journal ran in the spring that she thought gave the impression Black women lived only in the South. In 1905 and 1906, the New York Age, an important African American national newspaper, published several articles by Williams. Also about this time, Williams wrote columns for the white Chicago Record Herald. Williams was a pioneering sociologist, focusing on issues related to the home and education, and she associated with other feminist pragmatists, quote unquote, in Chicago, including Jane Addams, Mary McDowell, and Celia Parker Woolley. As such, Williams was actively involved with each one's social project: Addams's Hull House, McDowell's University of Chicago Social Settlement, and Woolley's Frederick Douglass Center. Williams's work in sociology, which focused not only on Black women but on other disenfranchised groups as well, was marginalized or dismissed entirely by the white male-dominated field as it developed after 1920. Williams's last major accomplishment was in 1924 when she became the first female and the first African American to be named to the Chicago Public Library Board. She held the position for 2 years before resigning to return to Brockport, New York, where she lived out her remaining years with her sister. Her husband died in 1921 after having survived a serious automobile accident the previous year. And here's a section on her major works. Williams's articles and reprinted addresses are difficult to come by, as virtually all were published in newspapers and journals long defunct. However, in 2002, Northern Illinois University Press published The New Woman of Color, the collected writings of Fannie Barrier Williams, 1893 to 1918. Skillfully edited and introduced by Mary Jo Deegan, the collection includes many of Williams's more significant pieces, including her 1904 autobiography. and her speech at the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. There are 24 of Williams's pieces altogether, and among them are eulogies for Philip D. Armour and Susan B. Anthony. The prose of Autobiography is lively and much more akin to the economical style that would continue to evolve in the new century, showing little of the floridness often associated with writers of the 1800s. Though brief, Williams recounts her racism-free childhood and tells of her family's history. Then, via a series of personal anecdotes, she discusses the overt bigotry of the South versus the more Machiavellian practices of Northern racists. And I quote, "I can but believe that the prejudice that blights and hinders is quite as decided in the North as it is in the South, but does not manifest itself so openly and brutally." End quote. In particular, Williams talks about trying to find employment for young black women in companies owned by white men. She baldly criticizes church-going whites, both men and women, who claim to have Christian values but are bigots in their daily lives. She closes her autobiography, however, with restrained optimism, writing, "I dare not cease to hope and aspire and believe in human love and justice, but progress is painful, and my faith is often strained to the breaking point." Williams had expressed many of these same ideas a decade earlier when she spoke to the World's Columbian Exposition. In the speech originally published in the World's Congress of Representative Women, 1894, she identifies Christianity and education as the keys for women of color to achieve equality in American society. She writes, "Our women find congeniality in all the creeds, from the Catholic creed to the no creed of Emerson." And she says that for 30 years, education has been the magic word among the colored people. Her interests in sociology are clear from the beginning of the address when she notes that less is known of our women than of any other class of Americans. She further claims that the power of organized womanhood is one of the most interesting studies of modern sociology. Her critical reception. How did people feel about her work? Scholarship on Williams has been meager, owed in large part to the scarcity of her published work prior to the 2002 collection. Deegan asserts that Williams was controversial in her lifetime and is to this day. Various historians have characterized Williams as an accommodationist, an elitist, and a dilettante. In her autobiography, Williams tells of having to pass as a Frenchwoman while in the South to avoid being subjected to Jim Crow laws, especially while traveling by train. According to Deegan, some biographers have blown Williams's admission out of proportion to make it seem as though she habitually misrepresented her ethnicity. Deegan writes, "Such a harsh interpretation of Williams, who did not pass as white in her everyday life and who fought for African American rights, ideas, and history throughout her life, blames the victim of discrimination instead of the oppressor." As far as the charge of elitism, Williams does differentiate between black women who are educated and moral, like herself, primarily Northerners, and those who are ignorant and lacking a sense of Christian morality. She does not criticize the women of the South themselves, but places blame on the institution of slavery and its tenacious aftermath. She also charges that African Americans of her day have difficulty living and working in harmony. She says, "For peculiar and painful reasons, the great lessons of fraternity and altruism are hard for colored women to learn. Emancipation found the colored Americans of the South with no sentiments of association." Williams does say, though, that black women have taken a leading role in trying to bring communities together for the common good. Moreover, her 1893 address shows anticipation of great contributions to American literature, art, and music by African American women of the coming generation. As far as being a dilettante, there is no question that Williams's father was a well-to-do man of business who made sure his children were well educated and well cared for, and Williams's husband was a successful attorney, so she did not suffer the same ignorance, poverty, and indignities that plagued most African-American women of her day. Williams, therefore, could have lived a quiet, comfortable life in New England or Chicago, but instead she worked on behalf of the downtrodden, regardless of race and gender, and risked her personal safety to do so. She moved south as a school teacher while still a teenager, and after making a name for herself nationally with her pen and voice, Williams went on lecture tours throughout the South. Deegan writes, "It is not her flaws that fascinate me, it is her frequent transcendence of her own limits that is exciting." All right, and then I provide a bibliography of works by Williams and a very short list of works about her her various writings and speeches and so forth. So anyway, that was my contribution to the Encyclopedia of African American Women Writers. Very proud to be a part of that. Again, I don't know that projects like this are really being done anymore because of the internet and the availability of information in that way. But I suppose maybe there are some projects afoot out there that still wind up in university libraries and things like that. All right, I'd be interested. To know of any women authors that you have read that you think people need to read more of, because they've sort of been forgotten over the decades, or really anything having to do with this topic would certainly be welcome in the comments below the announcement. So there's a little bit about Fannie Barrier Williams on this snowy February day. And I look forward to seeing you down the road.